Hi, I'm Dan Heisman, and this is my new YouTube channel for chess videos. We're going to focus on trying to help the people watching my YouTube channel get better at chess. If you don't know who I am, I'll give you a quick introduction. I am a national master from the U.S. Chess Federation. I also have a FIDE title of CM. They're both means my ratings in that 2200 to 2300 range. I've written 12 chess books. You may know some of them, like Everyone's Second Chess Book, or The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, or Back to Basics Tactics, or The Improving Chess Thinker. So I have 12 books out there. I've done TV shows for both chess.com and for ICC. I did the TV show for ICC called Ask the Renaissance Man. My TV show for chess.com was Q&A with Coach Heisman. And I've written a Novice Nook column, which is probably my best stuff on how to get better. I did that for Chess Cafe back when Chess Cafe was free. And the best of my Novice Nook columns was made into a book called A Guide to Chess Improvement, which is published by Everyman. Okay, so what are we going to do with our videos? Well, I've kind of broken the videos down into two types. I'm going to do amateur games with annotations, and I'm going to do everything else. This is very similar to what I did for my 400 ICC videos. I think I'm really good at going over amateur games. The idea on amateur games is you want to see what other people are doing so that you can avoid their mistakes, or when your opponents make those kind of mistakes, you know how to take advantage of them. So we're going to spend a bit of time going through those. If you have an amateur game for me, you can email them to me through my website, danheisman.com. And I won't use every one that I'm given, but I will be glad to take a look at them. Well, you don't have to, annotate the game or anything. Just print out the moves and put it in an email and send me the game. A lot of people have said to me, oh, I don't want to see amateur games. I don't want to see people putting pieces on pre. I think they're confusing the word amateur with the word beginner. In chess, the word amateur means that you're not a master. So for instance, if you play in the US Amateur, you have to have a rating under 2200, which means if your rating is 2100, which puts you in the top 3%, you're an amateur. So when I wrote my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, I think the average rating of the people in the book was probably in the 1500 to 1700 range, which is what a lot of the people probably watching this video might be. Some of them might be even lower. But the idea of the videos is to help everybody get better. I've had masters tell me that the things that I wrote helped them get better as well. But if you ask me where we're targeting our audience, maybe in the 800 to 2200 range. Okay, so what are we going to include in these videos? Well, we just talked about amateur games. And what do I mean when I say everything else? Well, the most important thing in chess is tactics and safety, so we're certainly going to do that. But chess is a thinking game, and a lot of chess is thought process. And I've written a couple books on thought process, like The Improving Chess Thinker, which talk about how you should think when it's your move, how to find good moves, what's your thought process. Closely related to your thought process, which includes analysis and evaluation, would be time management. Because how do you know when your thought process should end? How do you know when to pick up that piece and make a move? That's time management. So time management is very important in chess. We're going to look at typical errors made by people of all different levels, what causes those errors, how to avoid those errors. We're going to look at the typical average things that other people look at, like openings and end games and all kinds of stuff like that. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of fun. I was debating how I should do my first video. We could do the first video and talk about definitions or principles. We could do lots of things. I thought I would take a typical decision that someone would have to make in an endgame and talk a little bit about thought process as sort of an introduction to thought process. So I picked out this video which has an interesting position from one of my students' games, and I've shown it to many people with some interesting results. So let's flip forward to the position we want to talk about. So black has just played the move bishop on d8 takes the knight on f6, and it's white's move. Okay, so let's talk about time management a little bit here. Let's assume for the sake of argument that you're playing a speed game. You only have a couple minutes for the entire game, and you have to make a move here as white. Well, hopefully you would quickly figure out that the only two moves that make a lot of sense are to recapture the bishop, but you have got two ways to do that. You can play e takes f6, or you can play king takes f6. If it's a speed game, you really don't have time to figure out which one is better, which of course is the main thing that you want to do in a slow game. So in a speed game, you might have to use what I would call kind of hand waving. You might use general principles to make your move. This is something you would never ever do in a slow game. But in a speed game, if you can't figure things out, and good players can figure these things out pretty quickly, but most people can't, you might use some sort of heuristic like saying, gee, if I take with e takes f6 with the pawn, I'm doubling and isolating my pawns, and my king is blocked from that pawn on f7. But if I take with my king, I'm attacking that pawn on f7, and if I can safely take it off without losing my e-pawn, I can win the game. So I think I'll play king takes f6. And in a speed game, sometimes that's all you can do. But that's a very, very poor way of playing slow chess. If we compare this for a second with an opening position, let's go back to a Nimzo Indian. Let's say white plays d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2, and now let's say black plays bishop takes c3. Now, in this position, white really can't analyze the entire rest of the game to figure out what he should do. He has to use principles and heuristics. So he's going to come up with the two ways he can take back the bishop, and he's going to do some pros and cons. So let's do that for a second, and then we'll go back to our endgame to compare. So here, he would say, if I take with the pawn, I double my c-pawns, I isolate my a-pawn, but on the positive side, I have a semi-open b-file, and I have an extra pawn in the center to guard d4. If I take with the queen, I'm not disturbing my pawn structure, but I do put my queen on a square where my opponent can attack it with something worth less. I call that AWL. He can AWL my queen later with knight to e4, but my queen has lots of safe places it can go, and if the knight plays to e4, then maybe he can't maintain the knight on e4 very well, so I'm not too worried that he can attack me. So those are some of the pros and cons between those kind of moves. But in our endgame, you can't really do that, or at least you can't do that and play chess very well. You can't use general principles to make a move like this. And we just saw me doing that in a speed game. And in speed games, you kind of have to play it a little bit like it's almost general principles. Now let's talk about playing slower games, and let's compare what might happen if you're playing a 20 or 30-minute game with if you're playing like a regular game at the World Open or for the World Championship where you have 2 hours for the game and you have plenty of time left. So let's talk about that 20 to 30-minute game. In a 20 to 30-minute game, you would not say, well, I can take with the king, and that doesn't double my pawns, and I'm hitting this pawn on f7, so therefore that's got to be a good move, and I'll play it. One of the things you learn in chess is you're not trying to prove that the moves you're looking at are good. You're trying to compare the moves that you're playing to see which one is better. And here, there's really only two issues, and that is, does king takes f6 win the game, and does e takes f6 win the game? If neither of them wins the game, you're going to choose the move that makes it hardest on the opponent to get a draw. If they both win the game, then you're going to choose the one that is easiest for you to win the game. And if only one of the two wins the game, let's say e takes f6 wins and king takes f6 doesn't, then obviously you're going to play the one that wins. But you need to know that. What's the only time that you would not need to know that? Well, if the first one you look at wins easily, then you're not going to look at the other one, but you will double check the first one you looked at a million times to make sure that you didn't make an error, because if you made an error, you can throw away the whole game. So here, let's say you're playing that 20 to 30-minute game, and you have to figure out your move. Well, no, we can no longer use our principles and say king takes f6 doesn't double the pawns. That doesn't matter here. What matters is if both sides play perfectly, what's going to happen in this game? So maybe you could quickly analyze king takes f6 and see if you are winning. So let's take a look at that. King takes f6. What's white's threat? A threat is something that you can do that on the next move would be very, very helpful. And what white's threat is not to play king takes f7, because if white got two moves in a row and he played king takes f6 and king takes f7, black would just play king takes e5, and the game would be a draw because black's king on e5 would be closer to the f2 pawn. Now, why am I not making those moves on the board? Well, I could make those moves on the board and I could show you, But if you are always moving the pieces on the board when you're doing analysis, unless you're playing correspondence chess where you're allowed to do that, when you actually go play in serious games at a tournament or a club or something, you won't have the visualization skills. So I'm going to make the moves in my head and explain them to you and see if you can visualize them. And when I'm done, then I'll put them on the board so the people who can't visualize them can see them. So let's do that right now. Let's analyze king takes f6 without moving the pieces, just like we have to do in a real game. And we'll pretend again we're playing a 20 or 30 minute game where we don't have a lot of time. So king takes f6. What's the threat? It's not king takes f7. The threat is to guard the e pawn so that I can take the f7 pawn and then queen. So white's threat after king takes f6 is to play f4. And if white can successfully do that, then king takes f7 on the next move will win. But if white's threat is to play f4, then black must stop white's threat. And the only move that black could play after king f6 to stop f4 is king to e4. So after king takes f6, king to e4 is forced. If black doesn't play that move, he will lose to f4 and then king takes f7. So king e4 for black. So after king f6, king e4, if white now plays f4, black will play king takes f4 and the game will be a draw. So white has to find a better move than f4. But if he plays king takes f7, black plays king takes e5. And again, the game is a draw. So what else could white try? Well, he could try f3 check. And now clearly, if king takes f3, then king takes f7 will win. So after f4 check, white's still threatening to play, after f3 check, white's still threatening to play f4. So black needs to stop that. But he also has to be attacking the e5 pawn so that if king takes f7, he can play king takes e5. And the only move that does both after f3 check is king f4. So now let's go back and go through the line that we're looking at. King takes f6, king e4, f3 check, king f4. And if you can visualize that position, white is in Zugzwang. Zugzwang means the compulsion to move. If he plays king takes f7 on the third move, black will play king takes e5 and draw. If he plays any other move, like e6, black will just trade off the pawn, f takes e6, and then king takes f3 with a draw. And if white plays a crazy move like king to g7, instead of taking the pawn on f7, then black will play king e7 and draw. But that means all the lines after king f6, king e4, f3 check, king f4 are draws. And white has nothing better after king f6, king e4. So therefore, king f6 is a draw. Let's show you now the analysis. This is what we visualized before. King takes f6, king e4, f3 check, king f4, Zugzwang. White's under compulsion to move, and he doesn't have any promising moves. If king f7, king e5, black's king will come back and take the pawn, and it's a draw. That means that king takes f6 is a draw. Okay, now if you're playing a 20 to 30 minute game, what can you do? Well, if you still have a lot of time on your clock, you could figure out whether e takes f6 is winning. And if it is, you should play that. But if you don't have time, and a lot of times in a 20 to 30 minute game you don't have time, once you figure out that king takes f6 is a draw, you have to ask yourself, what are the possible outcomes of e takes f6? And the answer is, well, white's going to have two pawns and black will only have one, and white's not losing a pawn, so he's going to get at least a draw on e takes f6. So now you could use the logic that king takes f6 is a draw, and e takes f6, you have no idea if you're winning or not, but you don't have a lot of time to figure it out, and you know that king takes f6 is a draw, and even if e takes f6 is a draw and even an easier draw for black, it also might be a win for white. So you should just play e takes f6 and then try to finish the game without losing on time. Okay, so that's what you would do in a 20 to 30 minute game if you were short on time. But now let's talk about what you have to do in a slow game if you're trying to be a good player. You can't hand wave and say king takes f6 doesn't double my pawns. That kind of play is what beginners do in slow games. That'll keep your rating very low. You also can't use the same logic we just did. You can't say king takes f6 draws and e takes f6 I have no idea, because maybe e takes f6 is an even easier draw for black. So you actually have to analyze e takes f6 and see if it wins. And whatever time that takes, that's the time you're going to take. When I first saw this game from my student, I stopped the game at this point because I knew this was an interesting puzzle. And I went through with him the steps that I did to figure out whether or not white is winning after e takes f6. And I started with king takes f6, just like I did already in this video. So I said king takes f6, and I calculated for him the draw the same way I did for you. And then I said, all right, let's look at e takes f6. So we have to figure out what's going on. Now, one thing I know from e takes f6 is if my king gets to g7, my pattern recognition tells me that I'm winning no matter where he is and no matter whose move it is. There's an idea in chess called trebuchet, and let's show it to you. If, let's say, black does nothing and lets white king just march right up to g7, then if we get to some sort of position like this, where these are the four pieces here that are trebuchet, white's simply winning because if it's white's move, he has these extra tempos with his f pawn. And as long as it's not already on f5, in which case we couldn't get this position anyway, then white will simply move the pawn. Black is in Zugzwang, has to move away from his pawn, and he loses. So that tells me that after e takes f6, if white's king can successfully get to g7, then he wins. But can he do that without losing his f6 pawn? Well, white has several moves he could play on the first move, and maybe all of them win, maybe they don't, but let's try the most straightforward, which is, can I win by just bringing my king up to g5? All right, now again, you have to visualize all this. So e takes f6, king to g5. Now, e takes f6, sorry, it's black's move after e takes f6. And black needs to be able to attack the f pawn when white moves away from the pawn. So he has no choice. He must go to d5 on the first move. So after e takes f6, king d5 is forced. The idea being that at some point, white's king is going to make a break to try to get up to g7. And as soon as white's king leaves that pawn on f6, black has to be able to take it off the board or else white will win. Okay, so e takes f6, king to d5. Let me take the lines off the board for you here. E takes f6, king to d5, king to g5. Now black has two moves. He can play king e6 or king e5, but he must attack the f6 pawn so that white can't go king h6. So let's try king to e6 first. If black plays king to e6, white can play the move f4, taking away the e5 square from the black king. In that position, then, black's king would have to move away from the f pawn, the f6 pawn, and no matter where he goes, white will have time for king h6, king g7, and wins. So let's go through that. E takes f6, king d5, king g5, king e6, f4, Zugzwang for black. He would then play something like king d6, king h6, and then it doesn't matter if he attacks the pawn or not. Let's say he plays king d7, and then king g7, and then king e6, and then f5 check, which is our tempo move, and then let's say king takes f5, king takes f7 wins. And if you can't visualize that, we'll show that in a minute. Okay, let's try black's other move, because we have to follow the branch now to see what happens on king e5 instead of king e6 on the second move for black. So e takes f6, king d5, king g5, king e5. Now f4 check doesn't work because after king e6, if white plays f5 check, black will play king e5, and now white's in Zugzwang. So instead of f4, white will play f3. So let's go through that sequence again. You can always go back and redo the sequence in your mind, making it clearer and clearer to you. The more you practice your visualization, the better you'll get. If you're not very good at it, it's not like you won't get better, but you won't get better if you don't practice. So here we go. E takes f6, king d5, king g5, king e5, f3, not f4, now king e6, and now f4, and now we've transposed into the other line that we looked at already, where white was winning, so white's got to be winning this line too. So that means that e takes f6 wins. So now we know that e takes f6 wins and king takes f6 draws. Let's show the lines with e takes f6 to prove that I'm right. E takes f6. Again, white's threatening to bring his king around to g7. Black needs to attack this pawn on the next move. So he has to play something like king here to stay close enough. And if white tries king g5, now black has two moves. So we have to do two branches in our analysis. The first branch we looked at was king e6. And now white wants to take away this e5 square, which is the only other square where black can attack the pawn. So white would play f4. Black's in Zugzwang. He has to move away. That gives white a chance to come up. Now if black comes back, white will play king g7 and win immediately. So black will wait, and white plays king g7. And now black has a choice of king e8 or king e6. But they both lose. If king e6, f5 check, there's our free tempo. And it doesn't matter what he does. King takes f7 wins. If he plays, on the other hand, king to e8, now white doesn't even need this tempo. He has a tempo with his king now. Since black's not attacking his pawn, he can just play king to g8. Black's in Zugzwang again. Has to move away. King takes f7 and white wins. All right, so that means after bishop takes f6, that king takes f6 is a draw. E takes f6 is a win. That's what I figured out for my student. I told him I would play e takes f6. I think in the game, my student, who had plenty of time on his clock, said, oh, if I play king takes f7, I'm threatening the f7 pawn, and I'm not doubling my pawns. I'm just going to do that. That looks like my best chance to win. I call that hand waving. You don't want to hand wave when you're playing slow games. In speed games, it's quite okay. But he hand waved, and he played king f6 rather quickly. It took me 3 minutes or 4 minutes to say out loud for him all the lines after e takes f6, but you have to do that if you want to be a good player. Notice again the difference between what we're doing here, which is strict analysis, and what we're doing in the Nimzo-Indian. We're comparing these two captures with the recaptures. Bishop takes c3, check. In this position, you can't analyze the game to the end to see which one move is better. There's no way to do that. You can't say, on b takes c3, what are all the moves black can play and can I win? And on queen takes c3, what are all black's moves and can I win? It's impossible. Nobody could ever do that. So you have to use heuristics. You have to use principles. You have to use the pros and cons. The pros and cons of taking with the pawn versus taking with the queen, and use your judgment. Once you do those pros and cons of taking each way and comparing them, then you're going to do the one that you feel gives you the best chance. But that's not how you play the endgame position. When you play in the endgame, here, you can't just wave your hands at the position and say king takes f6 looks better. When I was analyzing this, I didn't know whether king takes f6 was better than e takes f6. I analyzed king takes f6 first, but just because I analyzed it first doesn't mean I'm going to play it. It just means I have to flip a coin and decide which one I'm going to analyze first. But I have to know, does king takes f6 win? Does e takes f6 win? If one of them wins and the other one doesn't, I'm going to pick the one that does, which turns out to be the case. And we've looked at what happens when you play a speed game, where you really don't have time to do that. We looked at what happens in a 20 to 30 minute game, where maybe you have time to figure one of them out and try to deduce whether the other one's better. And then we looked at what you'd have to do in a slow game. You have to use your visualization. You have to use your analytical skills. And in our video series, we'll be helping you with these analytical skills, trying to get you to be better and better at doing stuff like this. But I wanted to use this video as an introduction to that. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you subscribe to my channel. I hope you can also check out my chess tip of the day on Twitter at Dan Heisman. If you would like to give me some feedback, just go to my website, danheisman.com, and click on the little email character, the little picture of the envelope, or it says email Dan, and send me email. If you have an amateur game you'd like me to possibly put in our series here on YouTube, then send it on over. Thanks very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.